Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Stories That Scare channel, broadcasting from the darkest corners of folklore, the deepest mysteries of history, and the most chilling stories the internet has to offer. Every episode will uncover terrifying eyewitness accounts, forgotten legends, unexplained encounters, and stories so disturbing you'll have to decide for yourself what's real and what's waiting in the darkness. So dim the lights, lock the doors, and if you hear something outside, don't answer it, because tonight's story begins now. Before we begin, if you enjoy stepping into the shadows with us, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new nightmare. If you want to go even deeper into the darkness, you can also support us on Patreon or grab some official merchandise. It helps keep these stories alive and the channel growing. Now, take a breath, because once we start, there's no turning back.
I'm sharing this now because no one at my job would ever believe me, and I've changed a few details to protect my identity, but the events themselves are exactly how I remember them.
I spent 6 summers working as a fire lookout in Northern Ontario. If you've never done that job, it's about as isolated as a person can get. You live alone in a steel tower overlooking thousands of acres of forest. Every morning, you scan the horizon for smoke. Every evening, you log weather conditions, radio in your report, and hope nothing catches fire overnight. Some days, I wouldn't see another person for a week. I loved it. The silence never bothered me. In fact, it was why I kept coming back. By my 6th season, I'd seen black bears, wolves, moose, and more curious hikers than I could count. Nothing surprised me anymore. At least, that's what I thought.
It started during the last week before my rotation ended. Just after sunset, I was doing my final sweep with a pair of binoculars when I noticed movement near the base of the tower. At first, I assumed it was another black bear. They occasionally wandered through looking for food scraps. But this wasn't moving like a bear. It wasn't on 4 legs. It was walking, slowly, deliberately. It never looked up at me. It simply circled the tower once, then disappeared back into the tree line. I grabbed my spotlight and scanned the forest for almost 20 minutes. Nothing.
The next morning, I climbed down to inspect the area. There were footprints, not boot prints, not bear tracks. Long, narrow, almost human, but something about them made my stomach turn. I've spent years trying to explain why. I still can't. What really scared me wasn't the tracks themselves. It was where they ended, because they didn't lead away from the tower. They stopped directly beneath my bedroom window, as if whatever made them had been standing there, looking up at me all night. At the time, I convinced myself I was overreacting. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. I couldn't have been more wrong.
I almost didn't report the footprints. Not because I was scared, because I knew exactly what my supervisor would say. Probably a hiker. Except there weren't supposed to be hikers anywhere near my tower. The closest trail was nearly 15 miles away, and the access road had been washed out for weeks. Still, I radioed it in. My supervisor asked the usual questions. Were they bear tracks? No. Moose? No. Human? I don't think so. There was a long pause before he finally laughed. Take a few pictures. We'll look at them when you come down.
I climbed back into the observation cab, grabbed my camera, and headed outside. The tracks were still there, fresh, sharp. Whatever had made them couldn't have been gone for long. I knelt down to photograph the first print. Then I noticed something strange. The impressions weren't pressed straight into the soil.
They leaned, almost as if whatever had made them had been walking while tilting forward. The farther I followed them, the stranger they became. Every footprint was spaced exactly the same distance apart. Downhill, uphill, over rocks, through thick moss. The stride never changed. I remember thinking, that's not how people walk.
I snapped a dozen photos and headed back up the tower. By the time I reached the top, my radio crackled. It was another lookout, stationed about 12 miles east. "You got visitors?" he joked. "What do you mean?" "I've been watching your tower through binoculars." I laughed. "Yeah, just me." "No." Another pause. "I thought someone was standing underneath it." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I walked to the window and looked straight down. Nothing. "You still there?" he asked. "Yeah." "I don't see him anymore." I forced a laugh and changed the subject. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Around sunset, I transferred the photographs from my camera to my laptop. Every single picture was there, except one. The closest photograph I'd taken of the tracks. The file wasn't corrupted, it simply didn't exist. I checked the camera. The image number skipped from DSC 4187 to DSC 4189, as if DSC 4188 had never been taken. I told myself I'd accidentally deleted it. That explanation lasted until 9:43 that night, because that's when something heavy knocked once on one of the steel support beams beneath my tower. Not a branch, not the wind. One slow, deliberate knock. I waited for another. Instead, I heard footsteps walking in a slow circle beneath me. And for the first time in 6 years of living alone in those woods, I locked the tower door. At the time, I thought locking that door would keep me safe. I didn't realize whatever was outside had no intention of coming in. It wanted me to come out.
I don't think I slept for more than 20 minutes that night. Every little sound seemed louder than it should have. The tower would creak as it cooled. The wind would rattle the windows. Every time it did, I convinced myself someone was climbing the stairs. Nobody ever did. Just before sunrise, I finally worked up the nerve to look outside. The forest looked completely normal. No movement, no footprints that I could see from the tower. I almost laughed at myself. Maybe I really had let my imagination get the better of me. Then my radio crackled. "Morning check." It was my supervisor. I gave him the weather report. Visibility, humidity, and wind speed. Just before signing off, he asked, "You sleep all right?" I hesitated. "Not really." "You'll be relieved tomorrow then." "Why?" "We're sending a maintenance crew to replace the lightning rod on your tower." That caught me off guard. Maintenance visits were rare. The towers were designed to go years without anyone climbing them. "What time?" "Probably around noon." For the first time in nearly 24 hours, I felt relieved. At least I'd have other people around. Around 11:45, I heard the truck before I saw it. The maintenance crew stepped out, stretched, and waved up at me. There were 3 of them, an older foreman and 2 younger workers. I climbed down to meet them. As they unpacked their equipment, one of the younger guys looked around the clearing. "You've got a lot of tracks out here." I froze. "What kind?" He shrugged. "Don't know." The foreman walked over, took one look at the prints, and his expression changed. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he quietly asked me, "These weren't here yesterday?" "No." He nodded slowly. I didn't think so. I asked if he'd seen tracks like that before. Instead of answering, he turned to the younger workers. Stay together. Those were the only instructions he gave.
The repair should have taken 2 hours. It took less than 40 minutes. The entire crew worked faster than I'd ever seen. Nobody stopped for lunch. Nobody joked around. The moment the new lightning rod was secured, they packed the truck. As the foreman climbed into the driver's seat, he rolled down his window. "If I were you," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I wouldn't spend another night up here." Before I could ask why, he drove away. I watched the truck disappear down the access road until I couldn't see it anymore. The silence returned, except now it felt heavier.
That evening, I decided I wasn't going to wait for my scheduled rotation to end. I'd leave first thing in the morning. I had enough supplies to last another week, but suddenly that didn't seem important anymore. I started packing my gear before sunset. Halfway through, I looked out the west-facing window toward the tree line. Something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a dead pine. Then it moved. Not much, just enough for me to realize it had been standing perfectly still watching the tower. And somehow I knew it had been there long before I noticed it.
I don't know how long it stood there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 30. When you're alone in a fire tower, time has a way of slowing down. I kept my binoculars trained on the edge of the forest. Whatever I was looking at never stepped into the clearing. It remained partially hidden behind a stand of black spruce. Just enough of it was visible for me to know it wasn't a tree, and it wasn't a person. I reached for my camera, the same one I'd been carrying all season. By the time I looked back through the lens, it was gone. I searched every inch of the tree line. Nothing. No movement, no sound, no birds taking flight, just the forest.
At exactly 7 p.m., my radio crackled. It was the evening weather check. I gave my report, trying to sound as normal as possible. Before signing off, my supervisor said something that caught me off guard. "You've been awfully quiet the last couple of days." I laughed. "Just tired." "You sure that's all?" "Yeah." Another pause. Then he asked, "You're not hearing voices out there, are you?" I almost laughed again. Instead, I froze. "Why would you ask that?" "No reason." He tried to brush it off. "Just something the old-timers used to joke about." I waited. He continued. "They always said if you ever hear someone calling your name from the woods," his voice became serious, "don't answer." The radio went silent. I stared at it for several seconds before setting it down. I wanted to believe he was messing with me, but his tone hadn't sounded like a joke. As darkness settled over the forest, I locked every window and switched on the floodlights surrounding the tower. The beams lit up the clearing below. Nothing. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat by the east-facing window, determined to stay awake until sunrise. Around 11:30, I heard it. Not footsteps, not branches, a voice. Soft, almost too quiet to make out. At first I thought it was the wind. Then I heard it again. My name, spoken clearly, coming from somewhere below the tower. I stood so quickly my chair tipped over. The floodlights illuminated every inch of the clearing. There wasn't a single person there. Then the voice came again, closer this time. Still calm, still quiet, still saying my name. I reached for the radio. My hand stopped halfway because the voice wasn't asking for help. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't panicked. It sounded familiar, like someone I knew, someone I trusted.
For one terrifying second, I actually considered opening the tower door. Then I remembered what my supervisor had said. If you ever hear someone calling your name from the woods, don't answer. So I didn't. The voice continued for another minute. Then it stopped, just like that. The silence that followed was somehow even worse, because if something had been calling to me, it now knew I had heard it. At the time, I thought surviving the night meant I was finally safe. I had no idea morning would prove I wasn't alone after all.
I never opened the tower door. I stayed awake until sunrise with every light on, the radio beside me, and my backpack already packed. The second daylight reached the tops of the trees, I unlocked the door and slowly climbed down the stairs. The clearing looked exactly as it always had. No broken branches, no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading toward the tower. For a moment, I actually laughed. Maybe exhaustion had gotten the better of me. Maybe I'd imagined the voice. Then I reached the bottom step. My backpack, the one I'd packed the night before, was sitting on the ground. I know what you're thinking. Maybe I had forgotten to bring it upstairs. I didn't. I remembered zipping it shut beside my bed before I went to the observation deck. I even remembered checking to make sure my truck keys were inside. Now it was leaning against one of the steel support beams, completely dry, as if someone had carefully carried it down the stairs. Nothing was missing. Not my food. Not my emergency radio. Not even my wallet. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. Except it was no longer where I'd left it.
I picked it up without another thought and practically ran to my truck. The engine started immediately. I was never happier to hear that sound. The access road wound through dense forest for nearly 30 miles before reaching the nearest highway. I drove faster than I probably should have. About 20 minutes into the drive, I looked in the rearview mirror. Something caught my attention. At first, I thought it was another forestry truck. Then I realized it wasn't moving. It was standing in the middle of the road, far behind me, too far away to make out any details, just a tall, dark shape, watching. I blinked, looked down at the road, and then checked the mirror again. It was gone. I told myself it had been a burned tree stump, a trick of the morning fog, anything except what my mind wanted me to believe.
An hour later, I reached the ranger station. My supervisor was waiting outside. The moment I stepped out of the truck, he looked at me and frowned. He looked terrible. I didn't sleep. I figured. He motioned for me to follow him inside. Once the office door was closed, he asked a question that made my stomach drop.
You heard someone calling your name, didn't you? I hadn't told anyone. Not over the radio, not in person. I slowly nodded. He let out a long sigh. Then he opened a filing cabinet. From the very back, he pulled out a thin manila folder. It was old. The edges were worn from years of being handled. He laid it on the desk between us. Across the tab, written in faded black ink, were 4 words. Fire Lookout
incident reports. As he opened the folder, he quietly said something I'll never forget. "You're not the first lookout who's refused to finish a season." I felt a knot form in my stomach. Then he turned the first page. The report was dated, and the first sentence was almost identical to what had happened to me. Subject reported hearing a familiar voice calling from the tree line during the night. I suddenly realized my story hadn't begun with me. It had happened before, more than once, and that meant someone had been keeping track of it all along.
My supervisor let me keep the folder for exactly 15 minutes. "Don't take pictures," he said. "Don't copy anything, just read." There were dozens of reports. Some were only a page long, others filled entire folders. Different names, different years, different towers, but they all described the same pattern. The first report was from 1987, the next was 1994, then 2003. The dates weren't regular, but the stories were. Every lookout described hearing a familiar voice. Every lookout reported strange footprints around the tower. Every lookout said the forest became unnaturally quiet before anything happened. And every report ended the same way. The person requested an immediate transfer or resigned altogether. I looked up. "Has anyone ever disappeared?" My supervisor didn't answer. Instead, he turned another page. There was a newspaper clipping. A lookout had gone missing in the early 1990s. The official explanation was that he'd gotten lost during a severe storm. His body was never found. I stared at the article. Then something caught my eye. Someone had circled a sentence in red ink. His radio was recovered at the base of the tower. Nothing else. No backpack, no boots, no food, just the radio. "Who circled this?" I asked. "My predecessor." "Why?" He looked toward the office window before answering. "Because radios don't walk down flights of stairs by themselves." The room fell silent. I remembered my backpack, how it had somehow ended up beneath the tower, carefully placed, not thrown, not dropped, placed.
My supervisor slid one final document across the desk. Unlike the others, it wasn't an incident report. It was a handwritten note. No signature, no date. Just one paragraph. "If you hear your own name once, ignore it.